rye, which I just found out was for rhyolite, which is on the North Shore. And Jackie just learned about our scientific natural area, Iona's Beach. That's nothing but rhyolite stone. So we're all learning something new. So I want to introduce Jackie Fallon. And Jackie, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. I'm very excited to share the Peregrine Falcon story to everyone. Um, Peregrines for centuries have just fascinated humans. I got involved 35 years ago, but from the time I read a book about a boy and a peregrine called My Side of the Mountain, peregrines definitely captured my heart. And I'm lucky enough to have a career now focused with peregrines. So what exactly is a peregrine? For any of you that are experienced birders, it's obvious, but when you're first getting to study birds and watch birds, it might be a little bit hard. But the scientific name peregrine falcon means sickle wanderer. They're the most migratory of any raptor in the world, migrating up to 15,000 miles in each direction. And they've got some very unique adaptations. One of them is they're definitely built for speed. Those long, narrow, pointed wings are nature's fighter jet. Think Blackbird, a B-2 bomber. That is your peregrine falcon. And that enables them to go into that dive or stoop with very strong muscles on their keel to dive at over 240 miles an hour. Also, if you're going to dive at 240 miles an hour, you don't want to black out. You want to still breathe and get oxygen into your body. So all falcons also have a little bone in their nair. And in that lower left-hand photo right here, that bone is called a tubercle. And that tubercle helps to slow down air as it enters the bird's body so that they can still breathe and get the job done. And even humans have also adapted airplane engines with that same adaptation to enable their planes to fly faster so they don't stall out. Also on peregrines, you'll notice they have what's called a malar stripe, and that black stripe coming down below their eyes is definitely built and proven recently to absorb glare. Cheetahs have it, sports players wear it. And we've recently discovered that peregrines in more sunny habitat have a wider malar stripe versus peregrines that might be found in a less rainforesty or a less sunny environment. Another big thing with peregrines, again in this lower left-hand photo, is what's called that tomial tooth, this little square notch. So peregrines, like all raptors, have a curved hook beak along with their talons, but that square notch fits into a nice little divot on their lower mandible that acts just like a guillotine. So if a peregrine falcon is hunting something really large, like a sage grouse, a goose, a gull up on the North Shore, and if they don't kill it immediately on impact, they will use that tomial tooth to go right in between the vertebrae and sever the spinal cord. So it enables them to be able to dispatch their prey fairly quick, humanely, and then safely land somewhere. And especially for peregrines in urban locations, this is really important so they don't end up colliding with tall skyscrapers. And then lastly, any of your bird hunting specialists like goshawks, Cooper's hawks, sharpshins, or any of the falcons, they are going to have very long, narrow toes to reach around their feathered prey. So unlike a hawk or an owl that generally has a lot of power in their talons and very short, stubby digits, the bird hunters have very elongated digits on their feet. So again, if you look at all these things when you're looking at a bird out in the wild, these 5 things combined are what makes a falcon a falcon. And for us in Minnesota, that only limits your bird seeking skills to 5 species. So where do peregrines live? Peregrines are, along with barn owls and osprey, one of the most widely spread raptors in the world as well. They're found on all continents except for Antarctica. And we have 19 different subspecies of peregrines found living in the Arctic, living in the mountain ranges, the coastlines, in more arid environments. Before DDT impacted the worldwide population, peregrines were nesting in trees on occasion, such as this picture of peregrines in Poland, where they're still nesting in a stick nest made by another bird. And peregrines don't make a nest the way we think of other birds making a nest. They kind of eke out their egg-laying area by creating a depression in crushed rock on cliffs or on underneath bridges today. But one thing that is very common with peregrine nests is they're found near water. So for us in the upper Midwest, that basically means North Shore and the Mississippi River. Parts of Michigan, obviously, but they are not as widely spread with their habitat or range as what a great horned owl or red-tailed hawk would be. Now we have peregrines everywhere. We have adapted the landscape and created these alternate nesting sites like Multifoods Tower, over 600 feet tall, put up an artificial nest box as part of our recovery. Smokestacks at energy plants. They're a big part of our partnership in peregrine recovery. And again, like I said, underneath bridges and on historic cliffs. But how did we get here? Peregrines, a lot of times, unlike other birds, it wasn't necessarily poaching and certainly not falconry or even egg collecting that really impacted the peregrine population. Plain and simple, it was DDT and its counterpart DDE. And that chemical, by going up through the food chain, and when peregrine falcons would eat birds that had eaten insects, that had eaten plants sprayed with DDT, it caused an eggshell thinning. And Rachel Carson did a great job on bringing attention to this disaster that was happening out in the environment. And peregrines by far were not the only species impacted. This was the same cause of decline for bald eagles and osprey and even brown pelicans. And thankfully, DDT was banned in 1972. And that led us to allowing us to improve our peregrine population, bald eagle population, and then kind of move forward. The other thing too is DDT impacted humans the same way. It's just we learned about it faster with birds because of their sensitive nature. So before DDT was on the landscape, again, peregrines were never a really common species like red tails, great horns, even bald eagles. We only had 45 to 50 nesting pair in the upper Midwest. Nationwide in North America, from Canada down into Mexico, anywhere between 7,000 and 10,000 birds. However, post DDT, we really started noticing the decline in the late 40s. Falconers and other biologists were doing surveys here in the Midwest, especially along the Mississippi River and up on the North Shore. And by the early 60s, we noticed a significant disappearance. By 1964, we didn't have a known peregrine east of the Rocky Mountains nesting successfully. For us in Minnesota, that even went back a few more years to 1962, where we had a single peregrine hatch at Whitewater State Park in southeastern Minnesota. By 1963, they were gone. And so since this was happening on every continent, everybody was noticing the decline because of the use of DDT. The Peregrine Fund was established in 1970, and their creation came out of a Wisconsin conference held in 1965 that worldwide biologists showed up in a, not a real major metropolitan area like New York City or LA, but Little Madison, Wisconsin. And it was gathered and learned that basically we had wiped out 80 to 90% of peregrine falcons worldwide in about 30 years' time. That's a pretty significant decline in a fairly short time period. And so by 1973, thankfully, the Endangered Species Act had been formalized and peregrines were listed along with gray wolves and bald eagles with fewer than 100 known nesting birds in the lower 48. And this quote of extinction of the species was not an exceptional option was by Thomas Cade. We created this situation, we created this decline, and it was our responsibility to fix it. And so you can see on the map how peregrines had diminished significantly through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and were only found in very small remote areas with very little people. So for us, we definitely looked to the Peregrine Fund because they were having success out on the East Coast with some of their first releases in '74. They brought some birds to the Midwest and worked with us in '76 and '77. We released some birds on Maiden Rock and Nelson Bluff, but we discontinued because of great horned owls. Great horned owls, by far, in my opinion, are the most successful raptor there is. They can hunt just about anything. They have strong tenacity. They're silent flyers, and they're able to easily dispatch young, naive, captive bred peregrines off a cliff where peregrines had no parents. And so rather than just continue to feed a bunch of baby peregrines at $2,500 a piece to the great horned owl population, we really needed to wait, rethink our strategy for moving forward. Also, by 1982, we had more captive breeding happening. And so through the Midwest Peregrine Society in the lower 48 in our region, we joined forces with a breeder in Canada, and thankfully to the non-game program for funding to be able to purchase captive bred birds and start our releases, Act 2. So we started releasing birds down at Weaver Dunes on the Mississippi River, right near Wabasha and Alma. And we discontinued it, not necessarily because of great horned owls, but we had previously released an adult female, and she was relentless and harassing these young, naive falcons. So we had to recapture those young birds, and we brought them up to the North Shore, where there's also suitable habitat. By then, we started realizing, okay, the Peregrine Fund has been doing releases of birds in Baltimore and New York. So how about we start looking at Minneapolis and Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Chicago, Indianapolis. And so because of the appeal, the charismatic megafauna, all these other states joined in. And the program ran by having all birds produced come through Minnesota, go through the Raptor Center for a quick medical check, get their bands, and then either stay here in Minnesota or be transferred to other states for release. And so that allowed us to keep a real consistent database and just have one clearinghouse for peregrines. Because again, in the 80s, they were still federally and state listed as an endangered species. By 1987, this was really a turning point for us. We had our first successful hatch of a wild peregrine, and not only hatch, but also successfully fledge in the wild. Her name was Maud. She is that bird in the middle with some chicks. She was produced by a young female from Minneapolis and a male from Weaver Dunes. She was the only surviving chick out of Minneapolis, and she went up to Canada and nested up in Winnipeg. And so that single surviving chick really gave us a little bit of hope and the belief that this could be done. And more chicks were being released, more and more chicks were surviving. And by 1988, for me, yeah, it was great to have this bird survive in Minneapolis. And Maud, she did wonders for our program. But to have wild peregrines successfully breed and fledge off a natural cliff was the true sign of success. And we're very fortunate here in Minnesota to have the natural landscape in our state park system. And I really can't thank them enough, because yes, we could raise the money to release captive bred birds, but we needed the suitable habitat to release them in. And without the state parks in our North Shore and Mississippi River driftless area, I don't think we would have had the success as fast as what we did. So those 2 chicks up in 88 survived, fledged off of Palisade Head, and have gone on and reproduced. 1991, we had our first wild produced bird produce chicks of their own. And that also happened right here in Minnesota in Golden Valley. By 1999, August 25th, the Peregrine Falcon came off the federal endangered species list. And our recovery goals at that time, the way the Endangered Species Act worked, was to have 15 to 20 nesting pair. If we could basically have half to a third of our historic population recover, then that was success. And you can see 107 pairs producing over 200 chicks was success. There's no doubt about it. And also, if you think about it, they were listed in 1973 and they came off the list in 1999. That's less than 30 years' time that for the cost of about $3 million and releasing 1,300 young, naive, captive bred birds, we saved a species for us in the Midwest. And we now have peregrines in places nobody could have ever envisioned them to live, like Topeka, Kansas, or Omaha, Nebraska. Certainly not in their historical range, but they are doing very, very well and finding success. Along those lines, for us in Minnesota, they came off the state endangered list in 2013, which also a lot of times people will think, well, they're no longer endangered. They don't need any help or they're not protected. And that certainly is not the case. The peregrines are still federally protected and state protected as a migratory bird. But ultimately, the goal for an endangered species is to come off the list because of success and not because they went extinct. And we definitely have shown that with peregrines. So for me and my job, a lot of times people will ask, well, what do you do? First of all, I start in December and January, getting all the necessary permits to conduct our monitoring and banding operation throughout the state. My field season technically begins February 1st with monitoring right down here in the Twin Cities, also along the Mississippi River. And then gradually by late March, early April, I'm up on the North Shore. We try and capture as many unbanded birds as possible to try and get as much information that we can and to mark as many of those birds so we can follow them through time. We also are identifying, myself and my team, we're identifying all birds on territory. If they're banded, then get the banding recorded. We do use a unique banding situation. I'll show you those in a little bit. But through identifying birds on territory, are they nesting? If they're nesting, when did the young hatch? When the young hatch, I only have anywhere between 18 days of age and 22, 23 days of age to band those chicks. Peregrines need to be at least 16 days old to fit the band properly, so the leg is long enough, but older than 22 or 23 days old, chicks start to run. And the last thing we want to do is cause a chick to prematurely jump out of a nest box or off a cliff ledge. And so we're very, very emphatic that our priority is the safety of the climbers, the safety of the team, and obviously the safety of the chicks. And so if we don't get all those numbers right, then we just don't band the young. And I've been happy to say we have never caused an accidental jump of a chick because of our monitoring. We have also never caused abandonment of a site because of our monitoring and our banding research. So peregrines are very loyal and bonded to that site. And as long as they survive, they generally will come back to that site. After the chicks are banded, they take their first flight. They often end up on the ground, like you see in this one photo right here at the Mayo Clinic. They're not necessarily always injured. You're just expecting a bird to fly that has no idea how to work those wings. And I know you're going to have another talk about, does wildlife need your help? And does that baby really need your help? Quite often it doesn't. It's just a baby on the ground, put them back up in a tree. What I do is I find a baby on the ground, do a quick evaluation through the Raptor Center or another rehabber, and then put that baby back up if it's not injured. And usually it's just that first flight is the most treacherous. By August and early September, most of the birds have fledged. We're keeping track of fledging success as well. But now those fledglings have left their natal territory and they start their first migration. Sometimes it means they travel 50 miles. Sometimes it means they travel 5,000 miles. And all through that, I am also writing a report to document everything we've learned, unique situations at a site, who the babies are, how many birds we banded, and what our success or challenges are. And through all of this, raising awareness of the project is a significant part of my job as well. And that is why I have the ambassador bird I use for education that you'll meet in a little bit. So on banding day, I assemble the team and we access the nest. Sometimes it's really easy. I ride an elevator up to the top of City Center, walk through a hallway, block off the entrance, grab baby birds, band them. I can be done in 10 minutes. Sometimes it's rappelling down a 500-foot cliff and I need somebody who has climbing experience, but I also really require somebody also to understand the biology of the birds, know how to safely retrieve a chick, and do so for everybody's welfare. Some of our sites, like when we're banding at Shovel Point, there might be 100 people watching us band. Sometimes it's just the 4 field team members. Sometimes some people are there to retrieve chicks at some of our more defensive or protective females, like the Mayo Clinic. And then I also usually have twice that number of people just to protect those of us retrieving chicks. There's a picture of a female at the Cedar Riverside Apartments in Minneapolis. 2 people protect the 1 person retrieving chicks with those plastic sleds that kids use. So the bird is not able to injure the person while they're focused on something else. For about the first 20 years or so, we took a blood sample and we use that blood sample for a lot of things, looking at contaminants, looking at genetics, who is mom, who is dad. We've had multiple pairs over the years, so we want to get as much information as possible. Also, during the delisting process, because we wanted to continue to monitor the population and make sure that the species was not in decline after delisting, we also collected unhatched eggs and we collected feather clippings. Just a very small 1/4 of an inch off a feather, sent those to Fish and Wildlife for data and to be stored for future studies. We discontinued that in Minnesota in 2015. We've got over 8,000 blood samples in our database. So we've got a really good, rich resource available. And if anything does determine that we need to change something, we'll then pursue that with our permitting at the state and federal level again. When we're banding, not only do we put a USGS federal band on the bird's leg that goes on the peregrine's right leg, but we also use a bicolored auxiliary band that has a letter and a number. So this bottom slide shows you N/2. I can read this band on this chick's leg up to 700 feet away. That allows me to not have to get close to the peregrine nest or the eyrie, but I can still identify who's on territory And now with photography, as good as it is, I get a lot of banding encounter reports from wildlife photographers on birds on their migration routes. And that has been extremely helpful. About 80% of our peregrines in the upper Midwest are banded. That is unheard of for a wildlife research project. This is the most heavily studied wildlife project, especially in raptors, in the world. And what we're doing right here in the Midwest, banding as many birds as we have. The other thing is, we put it in the chat. We've got almost 11,000 banded birds are in the database. You can access the database just as well as I can. So you just go to that link and find out anything about a bird, whether it's from Indianapolis. You can search by the name, the city, the site location, or the year. So it truly is a wealth of information, and trying to discover anything and everything about peregrines in our region. Some of our stats, we're averaging right around 70 territorial pairs of peregrines every year with a 60 to 70% success rate, about 3 chicks per nest, which far exceeds the federal guidelines for recovery of a single chick. We're producing about 120 to 150 young every year. Again, nobody, I think, could have predicted how successful and how prolific peregrines would be in this changing landscape and the adaptability of peregrines to an urban landscape. First eggs usually arrive by mid to late March, and latest fledging happens in late August. And usually those are second nesting attempts up on the North Shore. Although Chicago had a fledging last year in late September, I believe, which is really unheard of and way out of the normal range of breeding time. And then also, because I'm who I am, I'm highly competitive, and I'm proud to say that nearly a third of all our peregrines in the upper Midwest are right here in Minnesota. Again, because of the habitat and the landscape we've got. These are some of the points on Google Earth on where we have peregrines. Again, far exceeding the recovery goals. And then this bird in the multi-foods box, this is where it all started, on top of a 50-story building in downtown Minneapolis. That really was the jumpstart for our program. The different colors for the map just to differentiate different nesting types. Like green is cliff, red are smokestacks, blue are buildings, yellow are bridges. And you can see we've got a really good share of cliff nesting peregrines. Again, Minnesota is really leading the pack. You can watch this tremendous growth, especially from the 80s when we first started having adult peregrines on territory in 1986. And then we've kind of balanced out about 2012 and hung right around that 70 territory mark. Sometimes we lose a territory, sometimes we gain a territory. Disregard the 2022 data and how poor those numbers look. This graph was made before I had the Raptor Resource Project's Minnesota data numbers. And even with less banding effort last year, we still stayed within that normal range and producing over 100 fledglings a year. Also, we're very unique because of our habitat. We do have the North Shore, we do have the Mississippi River. I'd really like you to key in on these 2 points. Purple for cliff. This is Minnesota. Almost half of our birds are nesting on a cliff. They get no assistance from humans. They are living in some of the most challenging landscape out there without the plethora of easy food like pigeons on a city bird. And so this glider green are building birds, and you can notice we still have a fair amount of building birds, but the majority of our falcons in Minnesota are nesting on cliffs. And again, that is pure success in my book. Some of the considerations when you look at the data, we definitely have good years and bad years. The North Shore in 2012, after getting a foot of rain in a 24-hour time period, we had almost 80% mortality on the cliff chicks that year. So our production was very poor. The next year we had one of our highest producing years. With cliffs or with buildings and artificial nest boxes, boxes that face west or cliffs that sometimes face west are exposed more to that intense afternoon sun, which can be a challenge for young birds. They can't quite thermoregulate very well. So east-facing cliffs often are slightly more to an advantage, certainly not always, and there is always exceptions to the rule, depending on where that peregrine is nesting. If it's in a west-facing cliff, are they in a cave where they're really tucked under and protected, or do they have very little shelter and they're just laying on a full sun exposed ledge? We're also always trying to be aware of our impact on other prey species and that nestling survival to a fledgling age. Monitoring changes region-wide because of state delisting and federal delisting. A lot of the states like Ohio and Michigan have really dropped off the landscape with their monitoring or banding. For us in Minnesota, we're lucky because I work for myself and I just have to fundraise and make sure I have enough money to pay for bands and gas, and I'm good to go. Not every state can do that because obviously state biologists, you want to focus on other more threatened or endangered species or necessary species to manage. Sometimes the nest box is removed because of changes in building management. And also sometimes it's just a matter of time. Now that we do have over 70 sites, I personally monitor 53 sites from Grand Portage down to La Crosse, over to St. Cloud, up to Brainerd. That is a lot of sites to manage, band, and do all of that within about a 3 to 4 week time period for banding. And I just physically can't be in all places, or if they're nesting on a bridge that we can't get the proper equipment on a very specific day, or we have weather considerations and it's not safe to band, like here at John Lack State Park, those cliffs. That's a pretty steep hike to climb if the ground is saturated, and it's just not worth it to risk anybody's welfare. So we won't band. Some of the things we've learned, peregrines do not mate for life. They definitely, the literature and the data shows they tend to be more bonded to the site. We have peregrines that, like Soda there, he received frostbite injury to 4 of his 8 digits, and he only had 2 fully functioned digits on each foot, and yet he lived to be over 19 years old and successfully hunted. We've had peregrines breed with multiples of the opposite sex. We've had a single female breed with up to 3 males. We've had 1 male breed with 2 females. We've had mothers breed with their sons. We've had fathers breed with their daughters. We had a bird named Mendota who nested at one site for a lot of years, but she always migrated. One year she migrated, she came back, she lost the site in a territorial dispute, and she disappeared off our radar. We made the presumption that she had died from injuries because that does happen. The next year, she showed up at a different building about 10 miles away, and she stopped migrating for whatever reason. And that is one of those cases. Did she learn that migrating ran a high risk of losing territory? Did something else happen to her? Because we do have peregrines that migrate. We have peregrines that don't migrate. We definitely know peregrines don't migrate together somewhere else. The other thing is too, we've had peregrines have some pretty severe injuries. We had a peregrine in Indiana that got caught in a leg hold trap, completely healed up that leg injury, but he lived for another 1.5 years living with 1 leg and capable of hunting with 1 foot, and reared young and incubated those eggs with one leg. If a peregrine can fly, they're pretty hard to capture to evaluate their injuries. So with leg injured birds, there's only so much we can do, but we found that bird did fine. It didn't die because of starvation. It collided with a building, which had absolutely nothing to do with the loss of that leg. We're looking at migration. We've had peregrines from Duluth, Minnesota, and up in Lima, Peru, 4,300 miles away. We've identified over 120 different species of prey. And then recently, we've used trail cams at the eyries to identify development of chicks, prey brought into the eyrie, as well as getting bands read from some sites that are really difficult to identify the adults any other way. And this technique has been used by the Peregrine Fund for over 20 years. So we've used that a few times. For us, our latest thing is HPAI and how it relates to peregrines. Some of you may be aware that 18 California condors have died of avian influenza or suspect avian influenza. They had 8 cases at least a couple of days ago. For us, nationwide, we had 43 peregrines that died of avian influenza. 9 were here in Minnesota, including several breeding adults that could not, the young did not hatch because of the loss of that breeding bird. We had a displaced female down in St. Paul. We had a fledgling die on her first migration in Hastings, and some other additional birds. And so this year we are working with the state and the Raptor Center to look at virus exposure in nestlings and adult falcons. Hawk Ridge will also be part of this research to see what is happening out there and what can possibly be done. And so that is the challenge. Whenever new things, natural viruses, pandemics, endemics happen, what impact does it have on a wild population? Some of the things we've learned and why we continue to ban 40 years later. Again, we want to make sure we're not going to go down that same road of DDT from the 40s and 50s. Our contaminants at issue. We're comparing wild produced birds and survival rates to captive bred birds. Is harvest available? And by harvest, I mean, but with falconry. And falconers have played a key role in this recovery program. And we have proven through multitude of different research projects that falconers, the use of wild taken young birds has no impact on a healthy raptor population. And so we're looking at that now with our significant increase in the peregrine population here in North America. We're looking at fecundity. How many birds are being produced? When are they nesting? How many survive out of a brood? How long do peregrines live? We hold the longevity record because of our banding to know we have a peregrine in the wild that lived over 20 years old, when we typically would say there's no way a peregrine could live that long, the old literature. We're finding out they can, and they do just fine. We're looking at site fidelity and the behavior of the birds, their migration patterns through banding only because of transmitter costs. It gets a little bit much to put transmitters on adult birds, but we're looking at dispersal patterns. We've had Indiana birds come to Minnesota. We've had Minnesota birds go to Illinois. And then also that impact on other species, such as piping plovers up in Duluth, where you have 8 pair of nesting peregrines plus Cooper's hawks, plus sharp-shinned hawks, and other bird hunting birds. And then definitely everything that we have done with peregrines and that the Peregrine Fund has learned through captive breeding and releases has been applied to benefit Mauritius kestrels, apple mottle falcons, and certainly we would not have California condors on this earth today without this knowledge. I couldn't do this work without a phenomenal team. We've got 15, 20 people that help monitor help with the banding, climb my sites because I'm deathly afraid of heights. I thank the Peregrine Fund for getting the ball rolling. I thank the Minnesota Falconers Association for continuing 40 years later, monitoring and financially supporting this work. The Nature Conservancy for giving us that property down, or allowing us to use that property down at Weaver Dunes to do our initial release, as well as obviously the non-game program for those of you that have donated to the Chickadee Checkoff. A significant amount of funding from that project has come to us. This project would not exist without the heart and soul of Dr. Pat Reddig and Bud Tordoff there in the center. They truly led this effort and installed the passion in me and gave me the opportunities to continue their work 30 some years later. The property owners, other biologists, Dave Evans up in Duluth. I have learned so much about peregrine biology from that man. The climbing team, the Forest Service, who helps out, and then certainly MnDOT for allowing us to have the use of their vehicles to inspect a bridge while we're banding chicks, because there would be no other way for us to access those young birds. So with that, I want to leave you with this website, and I believe that is in the chat as well. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing and get Rye out, if that works.
Yep, we have a few questions for you, and also
Okay.
remember, polling has opened. So if you see on your right screen, if you hit those three dots, if you don't see it, there's some polling questions for you. I have about 4 questions here that have come up so far, but if you have a question, put them in the Q&A, and underneath the chat function is the website. And as Jackie brings her live bird, Rye, on.
So this is Rye. She is a 3-year-old ambassador bird. She was a bird I banded up in Duluth, Minnesota, and has a wing injury that prevents her from being released. So I use her to tell that peregrine story. And last year we met over 40,000 people sharing this unbelievable activity. So I'm going to give her something to eat, keep her busy. But yeah, we'll take some questions.
Okay, so Jody Coring is very interested in all this. She has several questions here. Are there any particular state parks that have more falcons than others, peregrines than others?
Split Rock Lighthouse has 2 nesting pair, one south of the lighthouse and one either at the lighthouse or just north of the lighthouse. And then Tedagooch State Park at Shovel Point, Palisade Head, and Crystal Bay. So those are the 2 most prominent state parks that are easy viewing for peregrines.
Okay, she also asked, is 55 too old to delve into being a falconer, and what type of time commitment does it take? Can it be a hobby, or should she stick to bird watching?
55 is not too old. I'm around that age, and I didn't get started until I was in my late 30s, but it is not a hobby for sure. It is an active hunting sport. And so it takes a pretty significant amount of time to dedicate to hunting with a live raptor. Your housing, the testing, finding a sponsor. It is different than using an education bird. And so that would be the first question. You can certainly still admire them without necessarily having the permits to fly them. But you can contact either the Minnesota Falconers Association or Minnesota Non-Game. They have a great website to learn more about the sport and reach out to us and see what's involved. And that would be the best thing to find out if it's something you'd like to pursue.
Okay, and just to let you know, the president of the Minnesota Falcon Association, Matt Latch, is going to be giving a presentation on the art of falconry, using falcons to hunt, July 19th. That hasn't advertised yet, but mark your calendars. So if you're really interested in learning how to hunt, that'll be July 19th. Is it okay to touch a new bird, or does this mean they get rejected?
That's a really common question because I know I was told as a kid, if you touch a baby bird, the parent birds will abandon the chicks. And the falcons have no sense of smell the way a mammal does. So the birds are not going to abandon the chicks after we ban them. They've invested 5 weeks in incubation. They've invested 3 weeks of rearing the chicks. We have never had that happen, but we also minimize our time at a site because we don't want to cause any unnecessary disturbance.
Do you recruit volunteers to help with banding? If so, where and how do we get more info?
Volunteers for banding need some specialized training, obviously. I have a pretty solid group to help just with banding, but what I really need are help with monitors, people to help monitor a peregrine site. And there are opportunities to observe bandings through that. And so you can reach out to me through the Midwest Peregrine Society. My email address is on the website or on any of my annual reports. But usually it's several years before people are properly trained on handling and restraining a chick for banding.
And am I correct to say you're a volunteer? So if people want to help, another way is to donate to that fund as well, because you need money for driving and bands?
Yes, I do not get paid for this position at all. I do it strictly as a volunteer. I've been fortunate to have a job that allowed me this luxury. So you can make a donation to the Midwest Peregrine Society, and those funds go into a separate account for my banding expenses. It's about $1,000 a year to band the birds. We have to buy climbing equipment, and we also need to put gas in our cars to do the monitoring or the banding. So your money is not paying me or paying for a really nice dinner out somewhere. It's going straight back into the research.
Okay, I have a few more questions. You need to put your bird away.
Yeah.
Okay. Just as we're waiting for her to put her bird away, our next webinar is going to be next Wednesday, Cold Water Hatcheries. So you can join us there. And remember, the polling questions are still there. And if you have questions, Jackie is coming back. Her bird was being a little difficult this morning. So I was happy she could go online a little bit. Okay, are there falcons, perhaps 100, are there falcons near La Crosse, the 190 bridge, I-90 bridge?
So there are falcons in La Crosse at the US Bank building. There are also falcons on cliffs before you get into La Crosse from Minnesota off of either I-90 or 61 at Dresbach, Queens Bluff, which is only about 15-20 minutes north of La Crosse. And so there are peregrines there as well. If you go to the website, every state has a list, an annual report that lists the individual sites. And that will give you a really good idea on where to find some peregrines in both urban or natural areas.
Okay, the next question, when birds nest on smokestacks, is it because a nesting box has been installed?
Yes, it is. And so for the Xcel Energy plant or We Energy in Wisconsin, those nest boxes were put in place because a lot of our smokestacks are near water and they're also at a significant height. Lots of pigeons available. So the energy teams are happy to be a part of this program, as well as the peregrines are adaptable to those sites.
How does the Raptor Resource Project help with the Peregrine Project?
The Raptor Resource Project people, John Howe and Amy Rice, are significant partners in this. They manage all of Xcel Energy's sites here in Minnesota and Minnesota Power. They do a number of cliff sites down on the Mississippi River, as well as in Wisconsin and Iowa. And so they have been a key player since the 80s as well, because of their founder, Bob Anderson. So their annual reports are on our website, as well as just going to the Raptor Resource Project website itself. You can find out more on their direct work.
All right. Are there any known impacts from peregrines inhabiting areas where they did not historically reside, such as Kansas?
Such as Kansas? That's a really good question. Not to my knowledge. I'm not aware of any problem. And although I don't work very closely with the Kansas biologists, I think if there was a problem, I would have heard about it, or somebody would have heard about it. The thing is, most of those Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakota, Eastern North Dakota, or South Dakota are all in an urban landscape. And so 50% of their diet are pigeons or other songbirds. And most of those songbirds are at a high enough level of population that we haven't seen a decline. They're not generally a mammal eater outside of maybe little brown bats on occasion. So not to my knowledge, but that would be a good question for the Kansas folks.
Okay, Lars Airedale says, good job, Jackie, as always. Next question, when you capture unbanded birds to band them, do you do that only with chicks? Otherwise, how do you capture them?
So we use the same capture techniques that Hawk Ridge does. We use either a noose carpet, so it's a flat piece of something with some nylon nooses on it. The falcon will come in to get a prey animal that's protected, and then we catch them that way. Sometimes we hand capture the birds. I've hand captured a number of birds on top of buildings. The female won't leave the nest box. I just physically go in and grab her. So there's not a lot of effort there. Or we'll use another type of a net. And it's all done very similar to what Hawk Ridge or other raptor biologists have done. Again, we can process and band a peregrine in under 5 minutes, very, very easily. And we pride ourselves on making sure we're not causing harm. So that's where the experienced bird handler comes into play. And most of my field team, my bird handlers, have worked with me for almost 20 years. Although I am training in the next generation, because I'm not going to be here in 30 years, and I hope somebody else is going to be stomping around Shovel Point banding young falcons. So I've got other new biologists training to continue the work.
Okay, this person asked, where can we see Jackie Fallon and Raya in person?
Where can you see me? This weekend, I'm going to actually, for Earth Day, be up at Tetagut State Park from 10 to 2. I'm going to be at Gooseberry State Park from 2 to 4. Whitewater State Park, Frontenac later in May. So you can find out locations through the Midwest Peregrine Society Facebook page. Any of my public presentations will be there. I also work very closely with the Mayo Clinic. And if you go to the Mayo Clinic website about peregrines, all of my community events are listed on their website. And so I've got a lot of upcoming programs at libraries and other venues. Pheasants Forever, I've done some stuff. So you can find out that way.
Okay. Next question, have you seen or partnered with Bryce Malting Company Falcon Program, BRIESS? They make a lot of multigrains that go into beer, and they support the peregrines as well.
So they must be in Wisconsin, I'm guessing, or are they here in Minnesota?
I don't know. She has a link, and I don't know where that is. So if Catherine.
So, yeah, unfortunately, that name doesn't come to mind for me. But we do have some breweries that do host peregrine nest boxes. And so if they are a partner in a project, it's probably through one of the other state coordinators. I'm just not aware of the 400 sites we have.
Okay, next question. Can you share a little bit more about your story and how you got involved and so passionate about peregrines, and what kind of training or education has prepared you for this work? Because you're volunteering. Everything you're doing right now is volunteering.
Everything I do is a volunteer. I went to undergraduate school at Cornell for biology and animal behavior. I found out as a pre-vet, I did not want to do dogs and cats. I wanted to do wildlife. But back in the 80s, women did not have as many opportunities for wildlife work. And I was lucky to talk with Tom Cade, who talked to me and told me about Dr. Tordoff at the University of Minnesota. And Bud Tordoff brought me up on a rooftop and let me help band a baby peregrine. I got whacked in the head by a falcon, and I have been a volunteer ever since. So either I'm slow to learn, but again, that falcon desire has been with me since I was 8 or 9 years old. And to be part of an endangered species recovery program and the constant learning is very exciting to me. So I truly do love my job, and not everybody always gets to say that. But volunteer, there's always opportunities in field research. You're never going to get paid a lot of money. But I will say there are certainly other rewards far outweighing the money aspect of it. To know I have banded every single baby peregrine at Mayo Clinic. I have banded 3rd and now coming up 4th generation peregrine falcons, where I banded their great-great-grandparents, if the chicks hatch and all goes well. So this would be my first year of 4th generation work. And that's really exciting to me as a geeky peregrine freak.
Next question, you mentioned potential current future threats. Have there been research studies to assess the impact of microplastics and or the forever chemicals, PFAS, on peregrines or other raptors?
So that has been done to some degree. There's been some work with mercury. There's some work coming up with flame retardants in the foam, with eggshell thinning and impact not just peregrines, but other species of birds. And so that is why we are still doing the research 40 years later, because somebody will say, well, they're federally delisted, they're state delisted. Why do you still spend $5,000 a year to ban these birds and put 20,000 miles on my car? Because we're still learning. I don't want us to ever get behind that 8 ball again and miss the boat with what could be impacting, again, not only peregrines, but other species as well.
Okay, I think the last question we'll ask is, oh, and somebody did say the malting company was in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. But the last question is, have you ever been injured by a falcon?
Yes, I have. If you get hit in the head by something that flies 100+ miles an hour, you are going to get injured. I have received a concussion from a peregrine once in Minneapolis that was wearing a hard hat. And that was, I was nearly a block away on a rooftop monitoring her. She was a really defensive bird. I never thought she was that defensive. And I learned the hard way. Oh, yes, she was. But again, that's where, especially at banding time, we rely on bodyguards. Somebody else watching the defensive birds while I don't have to worry about getting struck. They will, we use umbrellas is actually our latest trick, using big golf-size umbrellas, like at a golf course. And 2-3 people can fit under that umbrella and are very well sheltered from being struck by a peregrine. So that is our latest and greatest defensive device. So you work with animals, you're going to get hurt regardless of what animal you work with, but it's still worth it at the end of the day for me.
Well, I want to thank you, Jackie, for doing this presentation today. You were great as always. People want to help you out. They're asking for how do I contact you. We put your the Midwest Peregrine website on our chat function, so they can go right through there to find your email and contact you directly. And remember, everybody, on July 19th, the Art of Falconry by the president of the Minnesota Falcon Association will be given a presentation on our webinar. Next week on the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series will be coldwater hatcheries, and I hope you can all join us then. And thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jackie, for volunteering your time and talents. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.